Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the PR Report. I'm your host, Pleb Rising. In today's episode, we'll be continuing our look at the sovereign individual, this time focusing on Chapter 3's East of Eden, the Agricultural Revolution and the Sophistication of Violence. This is the third episode of the report, so if you're just joining us for the first time, welcome aboard. And if you've been following along, it's nice to have you back. As a quick recap, the first two episodes of the PR report introduced the book and mentioned that it's about how the transition into the information age can be seen as an opportunity, if not the opportunity, for individuals to empower themselves and how they might go about doing so. And we also define the concepts of the logic of violence and megapolitics as a way to tease out conclusions from historical changes so that we are able to construct better forecasts for ourselves today when making sense of this new revolution of power that is liberating individuals at the expense of the 20th century nation state. The book's theme, i.e., all of these microprocessing based technological enhancements that have been, are currently, and will continue to drastically alter our orientation towards reality and how we all move into the future. So, Chapter 3, the Agricultural Revolution and the Sophistication of Violence. What was the Agricultural Revolution? Essentially, it was a several thousand-year response to a mega-political shift on the climatic front. And quick recap, megapolitics can roughly be divided into four categories: topography, climate, microbes, and technology. So this agricultural revolution was a response to a mega political change on the climatic front. And before this, people were essentially, they were hunter and gatherers for several hundred thousand years. And the characteristics of how humans behaved at this time can be described as the fact that they had an attenuated horizon of time. They lived more in the moment, more in the day-to-day time frame. They didn't have a lot of concerns about things happening in the future or what was going on in the past. They were more living immediately in the moment. And they moved around a lot. They drifted where they pleased, when they pleased, and as needed. They really had no sense of value being bound up in stationary assets. There wasn't a lot of ideas of what personal property was or things like that. In fact, they most likely had very few belongings, as that would have made it harder to stay mobile. They worked very little or had no concept of work like we do today. And that's such a common concept for us. Everybody has jobs and you go to work. But the concept of work to them would have meant nothing in the sense of what it means to us today. They had no crops to tend. They had no herd to watch. There was no livestock that they took care of. Again, there's no personal ownership of assets. Most likely they would have shared resources, shared knowledge, shared everything. And they really answered to no one in terms of an overlord or lords or governing body. They were small groups of people that moved around and cooperated with one another. So then, if this agricultural revolution was a several thousand-year response to a mega political shift on the climatic front, what shifted climatically? We talked about this in our previous video in chapter 2 of that climatic shift. You go over here where we're describing some examples of past mega political shifts on the climate front. Say the end of the most recent ice age around 13,000 years ago spawned the transition from hunter-gatherer to farming. The warmer temperatures brought increases in rainfall to grassland areas, which turned them into beech forests. And this changed the topography and their ability to forage. It also put downward pressure on the large mammals of the megafauna that were around in the Pleistocene era. The grasslands shrinking and disappearing made it harder for those populations of megafauna to exist. And those megafauna also received pressure from the hunter-gatherers in terms of hunting. And I will say, over the last 20 years, some emerging evidence of a very drastic climatic shift that may or may not have happened, most likely did, in terms of a comet entering the atmosphere and breaking up and causing a very sudden shift in terms of the environment and how the Earth's weather patterns were behaving at that time. Regardless, however that actually went down, is the climate did shift. It shifted dramatically, whether it was over a short-term period or a longer-term period. And this greatly affected humans as they existed on Earth at that time. So how did humanity respond to this shift? The main shift that happened in response to this was the introduction of tilling and harvesting. So that could be seen as a technological megapolitical shift in combination or response to this climatic shift. In general, how were humans or humanity different after this shift occurred? Well, essentially, there was the transition from hunter gathering into farming and an agricultural society. Now, again, this didn't happen overnight. The shift to an agricultural society, literally unfolded over thousands of years. So it was a gradual shift, but in general, from a high level, as this was happening, could be characterized as humans having an expanded horizon of time. If you think about what hunter gatherers were doing was more in response to immediate moments, farmers or people living in an agricultural society need to have an expanded horizon of time because you're planting crops, you need to know when to plant them. You're taking care of crops, you need to know when to harvest them. And because of that, you're going to have more of an interest in the passage of time, the cycles of time, becoming more aware of it, perhaps recognizing patterns, yearly cycles. You'll see the emergence of calendars in response to this, an emphasis on astronomy, watching the stars, using this information you can see in the sky as a way to guide and inform you about how to plant your crops, when to plant your crops, where to plant your crops, maybe. In addition, farmers compared to hunter-gatherers were much more stationary. And that makes sense, obviously, because if you have livestock or crops that you're growing, you have to be around to take care of them. And you have an emergence of being able to see value in stationary assets. Now, this is something drastically different from what a hunter-gatherer culture would have been able to even really conceptualize, is looking at a plot of land and seeing value in it, this notion of value being bound up into these things that you're taking care of that are around you. In addition, there is an emergence of a concept of work, and that just comes directly from being in the fields, working the fields, planting your crops, cultivating them, harvesting them, taking care of your livestock, all the stuff that comes with that. And there's also this notion that emerged of personal ownership in property, which kind of ties into seeing the value in stationary assets. So hunter-gatherers typically, most likely, didn't have personal ownership and or a notion of what property was, but as farmers became more and more sophisticated throughout the centuries, there was that notion of personal ownership. You had a plot of land, and if you had that plot of land that was yours, you had to maintain it, you had to upkeep it, take care of it, clear it. And eventually that turned into paying taxes farther down the road. And those taxes that they ended up paying could have been in grain or in work, just through their sweat and labor, or eventually in money. So those are the responses that unfolded over several thousand years to the mega political shift on the climatic front that was the agricultural revolution. How did this revolution sophisticate violence? You look back at the name of the chapter, the agricultural revolution and the sophistication of violence. How did that unfold? One of the main things one can characterize this transition with is the emergence of specialization. Now, that's not to say hunter-gatherers weren't specialized in their own ways. They certainly were. But the specialization that took place in the unfolding of the agricultural revolution is more fine-grained. You have several categories here. Mostly the specialization occurred between farmers and herders, people who looked after livestock, like maybe a herd of sheep or cows or whatever. This is the bulk of it. But then you also had an emergence of artisans or people who are making use of the products produced by the farmers and the herders. If you have a bunch of farmers and they harvest grain, that needs to get milled down into flour. Or if you're growing grapes, that could get made into wine. So you have post-producers, artisans, people making pots, all kinds of stuff that unfolds from that. You also have blacksmiths, people that are making tools and implements that allow farmers and herders to do what they do. And this area of specialization is going to lead to people or individuals that own more than others. And eventually, how that unfolds is some people end up owning the land, and there's going to be people that work on it. So eventually, you have those who controlled, and that was relatively few, and you have those that worked, and that was relatively many. In addition to this emergence of specialization is you had the specialization of violence. Now, this is interesting because if you've followed along from the first two videos, we talk a lot about the logic of violence and how these mega political shifts raise and lower the costs and or returns on violence. And so now, because of the agricultural revolution, we have an emergence of the specialization of violence. That can be characterized as violence in the sense it protects from plunderers or would-be thieves, or violence in the sense that you are plundering or doing the stealing. And with that, you have the appearance of a warrior class who becomes wealthy. And these are essentially the first kings. The first kings were essentially warlords. They were rewarded with perhaps a portion of the annual harvest, a portion of the herds, maybe land or property, things like that. And so why specialize in violence? The main reason, again, this goes back to the logic of violence, is because it paid. The rewards were high enough. If you were good enough at violence and you could pull it off, you got to control more land, you could steal from it, and basically do whatever you want. Another thing that's interesting about the evolution of the agricultural society is, along with this notion of personal property and goods and services being exchanged and built upon, is this notion of accounting. And it arises from the fact that there's now assets to plunder and protect. So you need a notion of inventory, record keeping, possibly for taxes, receipts, etc. In addition to how this revolution sophisticated violence with the emergence of specialization, you have the notion of the few and the many. And the farmers that are the few are the ones who are able to amass capital and build up their quantity of land or resources and be in control of that. And your threats to that, if you're one of those people, are expropriation. Somebody could come along and take it away from you. And if you're not strong enough to defend that, there's nothing you're going to be able to do to prevent it from being taken away. Or you could just be attacked. And if you're one of the many and let's say you're a smaller scale farmer working your plot of land and you're working season to season, you're also susceptible to attack and plunder. But you're also, in addition to that, you're at the whim of perhaps a bad harvest or ruined crops that could come from, maybe there was a drought that year, it didn't rain. Maybe it rained too much and your crops were flooded out, or maybe there was some bugs or, plague locusts or whatever that wiped out everything. And if that happened, you essentially faced starvation because you couldn't count on that season's crops to give you food and sustain you through the winter. So that pressure for the many who were the smaller scale farmers or perhaps the workers resulted in this system of closed villages that emerged on the landscape. And we're talking throughout the post-Roman Empire. So you have closed villages that emerged as a way for peasants, the many, to reduce their risks. And they're reducing their risks of predatory violence and of low productivity, both things that threaten their livelihood and survival, essentially. And the trade-off there is that, yes, it took away from the farmer's ability to participate in open markets. Instead of harvesting your crop and then taking it and selling it for the best price you can wherever, you're going to give your harvest over to the local controller of the land or the governing body or whatever that might be. That trade-off resulted in lower wages, in decreased chances of capital accumulation. You still had some, but you were foregoing a lot of that opportunity to accumulate capital because you wanted to optimize for protection and stability and the dependability of an insurance policy. So if there was something that wiped out your crops for that year, you weren't going to starve. The response to those threats was that eventually these closed villages turned into feudalism. And feudalism was the response of agricultural society to the collapse of order at a time of low productivity. So this kind of zooms in closer on the feudal revolution of the year 1000, so at the end of the 10th century in Europe, to examine how some of these dynamics were playing out. You had backtracking a little bit, you had the collapse of the Roman Empire around the end of the 5th century. And that was actually a good thing for small landowners and rural farmers in the sense that there wasn't this huge empire around anymore to tax you to death and basically absorb all your income just by taking it away. And the Germanic lieutenants and tribes that maintained control over the Western Roman Empire after the 5th century were much more lax on taxation and much more favorable towards free land ownership. And so that was a good thing for farmers in Europe. Again, they weren't overtaxed. The Germanic leaders supported the freeholding of land. There were fewer people to divvy up land between, and that just had a lot to do with wars and famines and plagues that had unfolded in the wake of the Roman Empire. There were also a couple of technological improvements that made it easier to clear forested land around that time. And these were the wheel-mounted heavy plow and improved harness for multiple oxen. So that it increased the productivity of farmers. And around that time, roughly 50% of cultivatable land was in the hands of freeholders, which was about 2/3 of the population. And only around 10% of the population were wealthy landowners. In the wake of the essentially collapse of the Western Roman Empire, it was a good time for small-scale yeoman free landholding farmers across Europe in general. After several centuries, however, things begin to change. And you see that across the Near East and Europe, populations recovered. So population is up, and there's more land being divided up into smaller and smaller portions once again. Also, around the end of the 10th century, you had colder temps. There's several years of colder weather, and that put a downward pressure on crop yields. There's also some plagues. Some living's tough, times aren't easy. You also had technological advances which improved efficiency of cavalry. This was the emerging knight class. And there's a few enhancements here that really tipped the scales in their favor. These were stirrups that they used when riding horses, and this allowed them to attack at full speed. So imagine a knight with a lance charging at you. They attacked you at full speed with the stirrups. They wouldn't fly off the horse. They didn't have stirrups. There's less control. So this helped them a lot. They also had horses that had nailed on iron horseshoes. This was an import from Asia that helped horses, again, be more performant when going into battle. So you had contoured saddles, which allowed for heavy weapons, and you had a spur/curbed bit, which allowed for one-handed control of the horse, which resulted in better fighting. So all these combined helped knights increase their returns on violence. So you can see how these technological improvements around the 10th century, or around the end of the 10th century, tipped the scales, or began to tip the scales in favor of the knights, the armored horseback cavalry, and increase their returns on violence. All these improvements that the knights were taking advantage of were expensive, and they weren't easy to get your hands on. So if you're a small-scale farmer, small-scale landholder, you're not going to have excess capital to deploy into these technological improvements. You might not even be able to buy a war horse. You just have horses that are more suited for farming. And it was harder to get your hands on things. So again, this tips the scale in the favor of those who are able to take advantage of those technological improvements. And if you're able to take advantage of those technological improvements, you're going to increase your returns on violence. So essentially, we have a combination of technology and climate, which gave way to an upsurge in violence and looting by knights who were rolling around, stealing land, basically doing whatever they want. And the late 10th century was a free-for-all, decentralized, bizarre violence. The result of this, many freeholders of land conceded their land to the church or other wealthy farmers who could hopefully protect them. This resulted in lords becoming nobility and holding land titles. Lords began to stack up in castles. These were structures that were heavily fortified and hard to take out. You also have the centralized church coming along at that time, counterbalancing the decentralized violence of the knights and nobles with an active and economically productive role. You have the knights, basically these warlords or sponsored groups of thugs running around the countryside with their technological enhancements and heavy armor and superior war horses tipping the scales, logic and violence in their favor. And then along comes the church and kind of tries to step in. And where the military power was fragmented or decentralized, the church began to emerge as a centralized organization, making headway into the restoration of order, peace, and keeping violence from being so widespread. They also educated via universities and transferred knowledge via their scriptoriums. So these scriptoriums on the monasteries were essentially the only place at the time that people wrote anything down or shared ideas. Illiteracy was the norm across Europe in those days, and nobody could really read or write. And so the only place reading or writing was happening were at these monasteries. The transfer of knowledge was bundled up in the scriptoriums at the monasteries. Another thing the church did was that they increased farming productivity. So they would go around and work with people growing grapes, get grapes, experiment with making wines, and did a lot of innovation on that front. They also documented and shared best practices. So you have all these farmers spread across the countryside. They can't read or write. Everybody kind of has their own little magic formula of how to farm or do this, that, or the other. So they would go around and talk to them, figure out what they were doing, what was working, or what kind of problems they had, why they were having them. They would document that and then share it with other farmers. They also helped to reconfigure land for improved farmability. Think of like clearing forests or maybe draining swamps or like a marshy area. And so they were improving land and making it more farmable. And they also would sponsor projects like mills, which is a post-production operation in terms of farming, where they would take the grain and grind it into flour. And again, some of these public works that the church sponsored on the transportation front at this time in the end of the 10th century, around the feudal revolution, is the church was going around and repairing roads and repairing and building bridges. So a lot of the stuff was there from the Roman Empire, and it had just all fallen into disrepair over the last several hundred years. And so they started rebuilding those roads, rebuilding those bridges. On the waterfront, the church dug wells, built canals, built dams, they drained swamps, and put up seawalls around Europe. And on the land front, again, they cleared land, they helped maintain land, and just increased the overall farmability of the European countryside. Another thing the church did was indirectly incubating a market viability of cathedrals and monasteries and the like. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because in order to put up these structures, you're going to need people to work on them. You're going to need people skilled at construction or trades. You're going to need people who know how to work with precious metals so you can make all the gear necessary for your religious ceremonies. You're going to need artisans or artists to paint the cathedral ceilings or get the windows in there. All the stuff that comes with building these structures became not a secondary market, but just a corollary to the church wanting to put them up. So it kind of jump-started an economy there, or a marketplace. And that's going to do it for our look at Chapter 3's East of Eden, the Agricultural Revolution, and the Sophistication of Violence. My main takeaway from the chapter at this point is that we now have an initial example of a changing megapolitical factor that significantly altered the logic of violence. In this case, it was a change on the climatic front, which ushered in an era where humans went from being hunter-gatherers to agriculturalists. This transformation unfolded gradually over several thousands of years, but it was revolutionary nonetheless. Farming was an incubator of disputes. Farming created stationary capital on an extensive scale, raising the payoff from violence and dramatically increasing the challenge of protecting assets. Farming made both crime and government paying propositions for the first time. Thanks for following along, and we'll be back soon.